Good evening and welcome. Tonight, I'd like to tell you the story of Newcastle United. We'll explore the people, the city, and the generations of supporters who turned a football club into something far greater than the game itself. Whether you're a lifelong Newcastle fan, someone with an interest in football history, or you're simply looking for something calm to listen to before you drift off to sleep, I'm glad you're here. So get comfortable, dim the lights if you haven't already, take a slow breath, and let's travel back more than a century, long before the Premier League, before television cameras, before packed stadiums echoed with familiar chants every weekend. Back to a time when football was still finding its place in Britain. Because every great football club begins long before its first trophy. It begins with a place, a community, a collection of ordinary people whose lives slowly become intertwined with a game that nobody yet realizes will capture the imagination of the world. For Newcastle United, that place was the northeast of England, a city shaped by the River Tyne, a city built on coal, shipbuilding, and industry, a city where hard work was simply part of everyday life. It was here, among the smoke of factory chimneys, the sound of shipyard hammers, and the crowded terraced streets, that the foundations of one of England's most famous football clubs were quietly being laid. This is not simply the story of victories and defeats. It's the story of a city, of families, of tradition, and of a football club that has remained at the heart of its community for well over 100 years. So settle in, and let's begin where every good story should, at the very beginning. Chapter 1. Before there was Newcastle United. Our story begins long before football became England's favorite sport. To understand Newcastle United, it's worth first understanding the city that gave the club its identity. Nestled on the banks of the River Tyne, Newcastle has been an important settlement for centuries. The city's name itself reaches back to the Norman period, when a new castle was built overlooking the river after the Norman conquest of England. Around it, the town slowly grew, shaped by trade, industry, and the people who called it home. By the 19th century, Newcastle had become one of Britain's great industrial cities. Coal was king. The surrounding coal fields supplied fuel to homes and factories across the country, while the River Tyne carried ships loaded with cargo to ports around the world. Along its banks, shipyards stretched for miles. Day after day, thousands of skilled workers built vessels that would sail across oceans, carrying the name of Tyneside far beyond the northeast of England. Life was rarely easy. The work was demanding, often dangerous, and the days were long. Smoke drifted above the rooftops, steam filled the air, and the rhythm of the city was set by industry rather than leisure. Yet even in a city built on hard work, people found time for community. Markets bustled with life, public houses filled with conversation. Children played in narrow streets, making the most of every open space they could find. And gradually, another pastime began capturing people's imagination: football. In the middle of the 19th century, football was still finding its place. Different towns often played by different rules, and organized competitions were only just beginning to appear. But once the rules of the game became more widely accepted, football spread with remarkable speed. The Northeast embraced it wholeheartedly. It required very little. A ball, a patch of ground, a few friends. That was enough. For many working families, football became the perfect escape from the demands of everyday life. Saturday afternoons offered something to look forward to. Not because life suddenly became easier, but because, for 90 minutes or so, attention shifted away from the shipyards and factories and towards something joyful. Across Newcastle, local football clubs began to emerge. Some represented churches. Others were connected to workplaces or neighborhoods. Most were small, run by volunteers, and supported by local communities. Nobody could have imagined that one of these clubs would one day become known across the footballing world. At this stage, there was no Newcastle United. Instead, football in the city was divided between several different teams. each trying to establish itself in a sport that was growing more popular with every passing year. The city itself was changing too. Railways made travel easier. Newspapers carried reports from matches played many miles away. Crowds slowly grew larger, and football was beginning to transform from a local pastime into a national obsession. In Newcastle, that transformation felt especially natural. This was a city that understood loyalty. People were proud of where they came from. Neighborhoods had their own identities. Communities looked after one another. It was only a matter of time before that same pride became attached to a football club. That moment arrived in the final years of the 19th century. Two clubs, Newcastle East End and Newcastle West End, would find themselves facing very different futures. Their stories, which had begun separately, were about to come together. And from that meeting, one of English football's most enduring clubs would be born. But that is a story for our next chapter. Chapter 2. Two clubs become one. As the 19th century drew towards its final years, football had firmly taken hold across Britain. What had once been a pastime played in parks and school fields was becoming something much larger. Every Saturday, more people gathered to watch local clubs. Newspapers devoted increasing space to match reports, and football was slowly becoming woven into everyday life. Newcastle was no exception. The city was home to several clubs, but two stood above the rest: Newcastle East End and Newcastle West End. The names were simple, reflecting the parts of the city they represented. For a time, they existed as rivals. Supporters proudly backed their own side, and local matches between the two clubs attracted growing interest. Like many football clubs of the era, they relied on volunteers, generous supporters, and the determination of the people around them. Professional football was still in its infancy. Running a football club was rarely straightforward. Money was often tight, and success on the pitch did not always guarantee stability away from it. As the years passed, Newcastle West End began to experience financial difficulties. The club found it increasingly difficult to continue. Rather than allowing one of the city's leading football clubs to disappear entirely, conversations began about the future of football in Newcastle. Those discussions would change the city's sporting history forever. Newcastle East End emerged as the stronger of the two organizations. Instead of creating an entirely new club from nothing, East End effectively absorbed what remained of West End's football operations. Just as importantly, they moved into West End's ground at St. James's Park. Even then, St. James Park already occupied its familiar position overlooking the city. Few people could have imagined what it would eventually become. Generations of supporters would climb the surrounding streets towards its turnstiles. Children would make that same walk holding the hands of their parents. Parents would later walk beside children of their own. The stadium would become far more than bricks and steel. It would become part of family history. In December 1892, the club adopted a new name, Newcastle United. It was a simple choice, but an important one. Rather than representing only one side of the city, the new name reflected something larger, a football club for Newcastle. The word itself carried a quiet sense of ambition, not merely two football clubs brought together, but a city beginning to rally behind one team. The years that followed were filled with optimism. Football continued to grow in popularity throughout England, and Newcastle United grew alongside it. More supporters arrived at St. James Park each season. Local pride strengthened, and the club slowly established itself as one of the most recognizable names in the north of England. The game itself still looked very different from today's version. Players wore thick cotton shirts that became heavy in the rain. The footballs were made of leather and absorbed water until they weighed far more than they had at kickoff. Crowds stood close to the pitch, with little separating them from the players. There were no giant video screens, no floodlights, no worldwide television audiences, only the sound of the referee's whistle, the roar of the crowd, and 90 minutes of football. Looking back now, it's remarkable how quickly everything happened. Within only a few years, a city that had once divided its support between neighboring clubs had begun to unite behind a single badge. The foundations had been laid. Newcastle United now had a home, it had a name, and perhaps most importantly, it had a city that was beginning to believe in it. The greatest chapters of the club's history still lay ahead: league titles, cup finals, legendary players, unforgettable afternoons at St. James's Park. But before any of those memories could be made, Newcastle United first had to prove itself among the very best clubs in England. Chapter 3: The Edwardian Masters. By the beginning of the 20th century, Newcastle United had found its place in England's top division. That alone was an achievement. Just a few years earlier, the club had been fighting simply to establish itself. Now, it found itself competing against the country's oldest and strongest football clubs. Many expected Newcastle to survive. Few expected what came next. The club's directors had spent carefully rather than extravagantly, bringing talented players to Tyneside, many of them from Scotland, where the passing game was more developed than elsewhere in Britain. It was a deliberate decision, rather than relying on individual brilliance. Newcastle assembled a side built on movement, teamwork, and intelligence. Supporters soon began to notice the difference. The football was quick without feeling rushed. Players seemed to understand where one another would be before the pass had even been played. Years later, those who had watched the side would still speak of its elegance. One of the central figures was Colin Veitch. Born in Heaton, only a short distance from St. James's Park, Veitch joined Newcastle in 1899 and became one of the outstanding footballers of his generation. Yet football was only one part of who he was. He was a musician, a playwright, a passionate reader. He helped found what would later become Newcastle's People's Theatre, and he believed footballers should think about the world beyond the pitch. At a time when professional players were rarely encouraged to express opinions, Veitch became an advocate for the players' union and earned a reputation as one of the game's great thinkers. Around him stood a remarkable team: Jimmy Lawrence in goal, Bill McCracken in defense, Peter McWilliam in midfield, Jock Rutherford on the wing, Albert Shepherd leading the attack. Today their names are less familiar than those of Jackie Milburn or Alan Shearer, but on Edwardian Tyneside they were heroes. Behind the scenes, much of the club's success was overseen by Frank Watt. Officially, he was the club secretary. In practice, his influence stretched far beyond paperwork. In an era before clubs appointed managers in the modern sense, Watt played a leading role in recruitment and football operations, helping assemble the side that would dominate English football during the decade. The breakthrough came in the 1904-05 season. Newcastle United became champions of England for the very first time. For a club that had adopted the name Newcastle United only 12 years earlier, it was an extraordinary achievement. There was almost a league and cup double. Only defeat to Aston Villa in the FA Cup final denied them that honor. Success, however, was no accident. 2 seasons later, Newcastle won the league again. Then, in 1908-09, they won it for a third time. By then, there could be no argument. Newcastle United were not simply enjoying a good run of form. They had become one of England's dominant football clubs. Yet there remained one frustration: the FA Cup. It was the competition every supporter dreamed of winning. Newcastle reached the final in 1905. They lost. They returned in 1906. They lost again. Then, in 1908, they reached another final. Once more defeat. 3 finals. 3 disappointments. Supporters began to wonder whether the famous trophy simply wasn't meant to come to Tyneside. Finally, in April 1910, that changed. The final against Barnsley finished level after Jock Rutherford scored a late equalizer to force a replay. 5 days later, the teams met again at Goodison Park. Albert Shepherd scored twice. When the final whistle sounded, Newcastle United had won the FA Cup for the first time in their history. Captain Colin Veitch had the honor of lifting the trophy. For the thousands of Newcastle supporters who had traveled to Merseyside and the many more waiting anxiously back on Tyneside, it was the moment this remarkable team had deserved for years. Today, people often speak of the entertainers of the 1990s or the cup-winning side of the 1950s. But long before either of those teams took to the field, there were the Edwardian masters. They laid the foundations. They established Newcastle United as one of England's great football clubs, and for a while, it must have seemed as though the future would only grow brighter. History, however, had other plans. In the summer of 1914, Europe went to war. Like every football club in Britain, Newcastle United would soon discover that some events are far bigger than sport. Chapter 4: When Football Had to Wait. By the summer of 1914, Newcastle United stood among the giants of English football. The club had won 3 league championships. The FA Cup finally belonged to Tyneside. St. James's Park had become one of the country's great football grounds, and every new season seemed to promise another opportunity for glory. Then, on the 4th of August 1914, Britain declared war on Germany. Like every other part of British life, football was suddenly confronted with a question no one had expected. Should the game continue? At first, it did. The Football League decided to complete the 1914-15 season, despite growing criticism from those who believed that professional footballers should be enlisting alongside thousands of other young men. Around the country, newspapers debated whether football provided an important morale boost or an unnecessary distraction from the realities of war. For the players themselves, there was rarely a simple answer. Many had families to support. Some had already volunteered. Others would soon do so. As the months passed, the football gradually became less important than the headlines appearing each morning. At Newcastle United, familiar faces began to disappear from the dressing room. Some joined the army. Others served in the Royal Navy. Many worked in the industries that kept Britain's war effort alive, including the shipyards and engineering works that had long defined life on Tyneside. Among them was Colin Veitch. For years, he had captained Newcastle United through its greatest successes. Now, he exchanged football for military service, eventually serving as an officer in the Royal Garrison Artillery. He was one of many players whose lives were reshaped by the conflict. The supporters, too, found themselves living different lives. Saturday afternoons that had once been spent climbing the hill towards St. James's Park were increasingly replaced by long hours in factories, anxious waits for letters from the front, or farewells at railway stations. The city that had celebrated league titles only a few years earlier was now contributing ships, coal, engineering, and thousands of men to the war effort. Football had once offered an escape from working life. Now, for many families, there was no escape at all. When the 1914-15 season ended, competitive league football was suspended. Regional wartime competitions continued in different forms, but they were never intended to replace the Football League. Guest players appeared for different clubs. Military service often took priority over football, and results mattered far less than they once had. Newcastle United. Not everyone would return. Across British football, hundreds of players lost their lives during the conflict. Newcastle United was no exception. In later years, the club would honor those players, staff, and former players who never came home, ensuring that their names remained part of the story of St. James's Park. When peace finally came in November 1918, there was relief. But there was no return to the world that had existed 4 years earlier. Too many people were missing. Too many families had changed forever. Football would return. The crowds would return. The songs would return. But they would do so in a country that had been profoundly altered. For Newcastle United, the challenge was no longer to build on the success of its first great team. It was to begin again. And in the years that followed, a new generation of players would carry the club into another remarkable decade, one that would bring another league title, another FA Cup, and the arrival of one of the most fearless forwards English football had ever seen. That is where our story goes next. Chapter 5: A New Hero for Tyneside. When league football returned in 1919, it did so in a country that had changed forever. The crowds came back. The excitement came back. But many of the young men who had once stood shoulder to shoulder on the terraces did not. Every football club in Britain carried the weight of the war. Newcastle United was no different. For a time, the club searched for its identity once again. The great Edwardian side had begun to fade, as every great team eventually does. Players grew older, others moved on, and the challenge facing Newcastle was the same one faced by every successful club throughout history. How do you build another great team? The answer would arrive from Scotland. His name was Hughie Gallacher. Standing only around 5 feet 5 inches tall, Gallacher hardly looked like the sort of footballer who would dominate English football. Yet almost as soon as he arrived on Tyneside in 1925, it became clear that appearances meant very little. He possessed extraordinary balance, remarkable courage, and an instinct for goals that few players have ever matched. More importantly, he played with an infectious sense of joy. Supporters adored him. Defenders dreaded him. Before long, he was captain of Newcastle United. If Colin Veitch had been the thoughtful leader of the Edwardian champions, Hughie Gallacher became their fearless successor. He attacked every match with relentless energy. He chased lost causes. He argued with referees. He celebrated goals with the enthusiasm of a supporter rather than a professional footballer. He was brilliant. He was unpredictable. And he perfectly suited the personality of Newcastle itself. Around Gallacher, Newcastle assembled another outstanding side. Stan Seymour, who would later become one of the most influential figures in the club's history, was beginning to make his mark. Neil Harris provided goals. Jimmy Lawrence's generation had passed the torch to a new one. Once again, St. James's Park believed. The 1926-27 season became one of the finest in the club's history. Week after week, Newcastle climbed the table. Gallacher seemed incapable of stopping. His goals inspired the team, lifted the supporters, and carried Newcastle towards the First Division title. When the season ended, Newcastle United were champions of England for the 4th time. It remains the club's most recent top-flight league championship. For supporters celebrating that spring, there was no reason to imagine they would be waiting generations for another. Football has a habit of hiding the future. People live in the present, believing success will come again next season. Only years later do they realize they were witnessing the end of an era. Gallacher's Newcastle remained one of the country's leading sides for several seasons. The football was exciting. The crowds remained enormous. St. James Park had once again become one of English football's great stages. But football clubs are rarely shaped only by what happens on the pitch. Behind every victory lay difficult decisions: money, transfers, ambition. In 1930, Newcastle made a choice that shocked many supporters. Hughie Gallacher was sold to Chelsea. The decision made financial sense to those running the club. To many supporters, it felt almost unthinkable. Their captain, their goal scorer, their hero, gone. Gallacher would continue scoring goals elsewhere, but his years on Tyneside had already secured his place among Newcastle United's greatest ever players. Today, visitors to St. James's Park pass statues of men such as Jackie Milburn, Sir Bobby Robson, and Alan Shearer. Gallacher has no statue outside the stadium, yet his place in Newcastle's history is no less secure. He was the man who led the club back to the summit of English football after the darkest chapter in modern history. His team gave a recovering city something to celebrate again. But football, like history itself, is never still. The years ahead would bring economic hardship, another world war, and, waiting quietly in the background, a young boy from Ashington who would grow into the greatest local hero Newcastle United has ever known. Chapter 6. The Boy from Ashington. If you ask Newcastle supporters to name the greatest player in the club's history, you will hear many answers. Some will say Alan Shearer, others will choose Hughie Gallacher, a few may even look further back to Colin Veitch. But for generations of supporters, one name has always carried a special kind of affection: Jackie Milburn. Not because he was born to be famous, quite the opposite. He was born in Ashington, a Northumberland mining town where football and coal seemed to shape almost every family. The men descended into the pits before dawn. Their sons often expected to follow them. Jackie did. Before he became one of England's finest centre forwards, he worked down the mine alongside his father. Football was something he loved. Mining was how he earned a living. There was nothing unusual about that. Across the Northeast, countless young men lived the same life. The difference was that Jackie Milburn possessed a remarkable gift. He was fast, exceptionally fast. Those who saw him play often remarked that his long stride carried him away from defenders almost effortlessly. Yet speed alone never made him special. He played with honesty. There was little showmanship, no unnecessary tricks. He simply ran, shot, and scored. It was enough. In 1943, during the Second World War, Newcastle United signed the young forward from Ashington. Competitive league football would not fully resume until peace returned, but those who watched Milburn in wartime matches quickly realized they were witnessing an extraordinary talent beginning to emerge. When the Football League returned in 1946, Newcastle supporters were ready to dream again. The city was rebuilding. Families were rebuilding. The football club was rebuilding too. Jackie Milburn became the face of that new beginning. He wasn't just scoring goals, he represented something much bigger. Here was a local lad, raised in the same communities as the supporters, filling St. James Park every other Saturday. He understood the people because he was one of them. There was another remarkable detail. Jackie Milburn came from one of football's most famous families. His mother was related to the Charlton brothers family, making Jackie a cousin of Bobby and Jack Charlton. Although they belonged to the next generation, football seemed to run through the family long before anyone used the phrase footballing dynasty. By the late 1940s, Newcastle United had assembled a side capable of competing for major honors once again. The club reached the FA Cup final in 1951. Waiting for them at Wembley was Blackpool, a team featuring the brilliant Stanley Matthews. Many expected Matthews to steal the headlines. Instead, the opening moments belonged to Jackie Milburn. Less than a minute after kickoff, he raced through and scored. It remains one of the fastest goals ever scored in an FA Cup final. Newcastle won 2-0. For Milburn, lifting the trophy was a deeply personal moment. The boy who had once worked underground in Ashington had become an FA Cup winner with the club he loved. The celebrations on Tyneside were immense. Supporters lined the streets to welcome the team home. Children copied Milburn in parks and school playgrounds. Parents spoke proudly of a footballer who had never forgotten where he came from. If success in 1951 had been satisfying, what followed proved it was no accident. Newcastle returned to Wembley in 1952 and defeated Arsenal. Then, in 1955, they won the FA Cup once again, overcoming Manchester City in another unforgettable final. 3 FA Cups in 5 seasons. It remains one of the greatest periods in the club's history. Throughout those triumphs, Jackie Milburn remained at the center of everything. Goals arrived with remarkable regularity. Records quietly fell. When his Newcastle career finally came to an end, he had scored more goals for the club than anyone before him. For decades, nobody would surpass him. His record stood as a reminder of what one local boy had achieved. Today, a statue of Jackie Milburn stands proudly outside St. James's Park. Thousands of supporters pass it before every home match. Some stop for photographs, others simply nod as they walk by. It is less a monument to a footballer and more a thank you, because Jackie Milburn gave Newcastle United far more than goals. He gave the city someone in whom it could see itself. Honest, hardworking, humble, and fiercely proud of where he came from. As the 1950s drew to a close, however, another difficult chapter began. The cup-winning heroes grew older. The trophies became harder to win, and Newcastle United would spend many years searching for another team capable of capturing the imagination of the city in quite the same way. Chapter 7. Waiting for another golden age. Success has a curious way of changing expectations. Once supporters have watched their club lift trophies, anything less begins to feel unfamiliar. By the end of the 1950s, Newcastle United had become one of England's most successful cup teams. Jackie Milburn had inspired 3 FA Cup victories in just 5 years, and for many supporters it was easy to believe that more silverware would soon follow. Instead, the years became more difficult. Football was changing. The old First Division was becoming increasingly competitive, and clubs across England were adapting to new ideas, new managers and new generations of players. Newcastle struggled to keep pace. There were promising seasons. There were disappointing ones. League positions rose and fell, but the consistency that had defined the great teams of the past was gone. For younger supporters, the stories of Gallagher and Milburn became exactly that. Stories told by parents, remembered by grandparents, spoken about on the walk to St. James's Park. The club's glorious past never disappeared. It simply became further away. Yet one thing refused to change: the supporters. Week after week, thousands still climbed the hill towards St. James's Park. They came in hope rather than expectation. That distinction matters. Expectation comes from believing victory is likely. Hope survives even when it isn't. Few stadiums in England remained as full of hope as St. James's Park. There were still players to admire. One of them was Ivor Allchurch, the elegant Welsh inside forward often nicknamed the Golden Boy of Welsh football. Arriving in 1958, he brought intelligence and composure to the side, becoming one of the most gifted footballers of his generation to wear black and white. A few years later came another local favorite, Wyn Davies. Tall, powerful, and fearless in the air, Davies earned the nickname the Mighty Wyn. His aerial ability became legendary, and he quickly established himself as a hero on Tyneside. But perhaps the most influential arrival was not a goal scorer. It was Joe Harvey. Harvey had captained Newcastle during the FA Cup-winning years of the 1950s. After his playing career ended, he returned as manager in 1962 with a simple ambition: to restore Newcastle United to where he believed the club belonged. Progress was not immediate. Building a successful football team rarely is. Harvey placed his faith in hard work, discipline, and togetherness. Gradually, Newcastle improved. By the second half of the 1960s, there was a growing sense that something special might be developing. Then came Europe. In 1968, Newcastle qualified for the Intercities Fairs Cup, the competition that would eventually evolve into today's UEFA Cup and Europa League. For many supporters, traveling abroad to watch Newcastle was an entirely new experience. The club that had once conquered England now had the opportunity to test itself against Europe. What followed remains one of the proudest achievements in Newcastle United's history. Throughout the competition, Harvey's side defeated opponents from the Netherlands, Portugal, Spain, and Italy, reaching the final against Hungarian club Újpesti. The first leg at St. James' Park ended with Newcastle holding a commanding advantage. A week later in Budapest, they completed the job. When the final whistle sounded, Newcastle United had won the Intercities Fairs Cup. It remains the club's only major European trophy. For one glorious spring, Tyneside looked out across the continent with pride. Supporters celebrated not just another piece of silverware, but the knowledge that Newcastle United had once again earned international respect. Looking back now, it is tempting to imagine that European success would mark the beginning of another great era. Instead, it became something rather different, a shining memory, one that supporters would hold on to during the years that followed, because the decades ahead would test the patience and loyalty of everyone connected with the club. Relegation, promotion, financial uncertainty, moments of brilliance followed by fresh disappointment. The story of Newcastle United was about to become far more complicated. And yet, those difficult years would make the next great adventure feel all the more extraordinary. It would begin with a familiar face returning home. Chapter 8. The Road Back. For a few precious weeks in the spring of 1969, it felt as though Newcastle United had found its way back. The Intercities Fairs Cup had been carried home to Tyneside. Supporters celebrated a European triumph that remains unique in the club's history. Joe Harvey had fulfilled the promise he made when he returned as manager. Newcastle United were winners once again. The obvious question was, what comes next? For a while, the answer appeared encouraging. The confidence created by that European success carried into the early years of the new decade, and Harvey continued to shape a side capable of competing with anyone on its day. Then, in the summer of 1971, a new striker arrived from Luton Town. His name was Malcolm MacDonald. Supporters would soon know him by another name, Super Mac. Everything about Malcolm MacDonald demanded attention. He played with swagger. He spoke with confidence. He celebrated goals with unmistakable enthusiasm. If Jackie Milburn had quietly become a legend through humility and hard work, Malcolm MacDonald became a hero through personality as much as performance. He never hid from expectation. He embraced it. More importantly, he scored goals, lots of them. Within a remarkably short time, St. James's Park had a new favorite. Children copied his running style in school playgrounds. His picture appeared on bedroom walls across Tyneside. Supporters loved not only his ability, but his belief. Malcolm MacDonald expected Newcastle United to compete with the very best. It was exactly the sort of confidence the city wanted to hear. Under Joe Harvey, the club once again found itself dreaming of silverware. Those dreams gathered momentum during the 1973-74 FA Cup. Round by round, Newcastle progressed. Each victory brought another surge of excitement. The possibility of returning to Wembley grew ever more real. When that day finally arrived, thousands of supporters traveled south. Some went by train, some by coach. Others made the journey by car with families and friends. Black and white scarves appeared across London. For many, it was the first opportunity in years to watch Newcastle contest English football's most famous prize. Standing in their way was Liverpool. Even then, Liverpool were becoming one of the dominant forces in European football. The afternoon belonged to them. Newcastle were beaten. The scoreline was clear. The disappointment was immeasurable. No supporter needs to be told what defeat in a cup final feels like. The silence on the journey home says enough. For Joe Harvey, the defeat marked more than the loss of a trophy. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the team that had conquered Europe began to break apart. Players grew older, others moved on. Replacing them proved difficult. The standards that Newcastle supporters had always demanded remained the same. The results did not. By the middle of the decade, optimism was becoming harder to sustain. Joe Harvey eventually left the club in 1975, bringing to an end one of the most significant chapters in Newcastle United's history. He had captained the club, managed the club, won its only major European trophy. Few people have given more to Newcastle United than Joe Harvey. The years that followed were unsettled. Managers came and went. Consistency proved elusive. Then, in 1978, came another painful moment. Newcastle United were relegated from the First Division. For younger supporters, it was a shock. For older supporters, it was almost unimaginable. This was the club of Gallagher, the club of Milburn, the club that had once stood at the summit of English football. Now it found itself looking up once again. Yet something remarkable refused to disappear. The crowds. Even in the Second Division, St. James's Park remained one of England's great football grounds. Supporters continued to fill its terraces with a loyalty that puzzled many outside the Northeast. Other clubs might lose their supporters during difficult years. Newcastle rarely did, perhaps because supporting Newcastle had never been only about success. It was about belonging. By the beginning of the 1980s, however, patience was beginning to wear thin. Promotion had become the dream. Not championships, not European nights, simply a return to the First Division. Then, during the summer of 1982, a rumor swept across Tyneside. At first, hardly anyone believed it. Keegan, England's former captain, twice named European Footballer of the Year, a man who had won league titles in England and Germany. Why would he join a second division club? It made no sense until it happened. When Keegan walked into St. James Park wearing black and white, it felt as though the impossible had become possible. It was more than a transfer. It was a declaration. Newcastle United still had the power to capture the imagination of the football world. The city had spent years waiting for someone to believe in its football club again. Now, one of the most famous footballers on the planet had done exactly that. The road back had finally begun. And in our next chapter, we'll discover how Kevin Keegan's arrival transformed not only Newcastle United's fortunes, but the spirit of an entire city. Chapter 9: The Keegan Years. On the opening day of the 1982-83 season, there were more than 35,000 people inside St. James's Park. Officially, it was a second division fixture. It didn't feel like one. For weeks, the city had been talking about little else. Kevin Keegan, the former England captain, the twice-crowned European Footballer of the Year, the man who had conquered England and Germany, now wearing black and white. Every time he touched the ball, the crowd seemed to hold its breath. Every run was applauded. Every tackle was cheered. Supporters hadn't simply come to watch Newcastle United. They had come to witness something they never thought they would see. Hope, not the quiet, cautious hope that had carried them through difficult seasons. Something louder, something bolder. The belief that perhaps Newcastle United could once again become the football club they remembered from old stories. Yet Kevin Keegan was never meant to rebuild Newcastle alone. Behind the scenes stood Arthur Cox, practical, calm, methodical. If Keegan was the face of Newcastle's revival, Cox was the architect. He understood that lasting success would never come from one famous signing. It had to be built, piece by piece. Alongside Keegan came players who perfectly suited that vision. Terry McDermott returned to his home city after winning 5 league titles and 3 European Cups with Liverpool. His experience brought authority to the dressing room, while his affection for Newcastle made his return feel deeply personal. Then there was Peter Beardsley. Few careers have taken stranger paths. Released by Newcastle as a teenager because he was considered too small, Beardsley rebuilt his career with astonishing determination. Years later, he returned to St. James's Park as one of England's most gifted footballers. For many supporters, there was something wonderfully satisfying about that story. Sometimes football gives people a second chance. Chris Waddle offered something entirely different. Watching him dribble often felt like watching improvisation. Defenders rarely knew what he would do next. The truth was, neither did anyone else. Together, they formed the heart of a team that was becoming increasingly difficult to stop. The 1983-84 season unfolded with mounting excitement. Promotion was the objective. Nothing else. Every point mattered. Every away victory felt significant. Every home match drew another huge crowd. By now, Newcastle were no longer simply one of the biggest clubs in the second division. They were becoming one of the biggest stories in English football. As spring turned towards summer, promotion edged closer. Then, on a warm afternoon in May 1984, Newcastle traveled to Grimsby Town. A draw would be enough. When the final whistle sounded, Newcastle United had secured their return to the First Division. Thousands of supporters celebrated as though they had won a trophy. In many ways, they had. Promotion meant more than moving up a division. It meant Newcastle United was finally back where its supporters believed it belonged. For Kevin Keegan, it was the perfect ending. Shortly after promotion was secured, he announced that he would retire from professional football. His time on Tyneside had lasted just 2 seasons. Measured in years, it was brief. Measured in influence, it was immense. He had reminded the football world that Newcastle United still possessed a unique pull. More importantly, he had reminded the city itself. The years that followed were filled with moments of genuine excitement. Arthur Cox continued to build an ambitious side. Young talent flourished. St. James Park was alive once more. Yet football has a habit of refusing happy endings. In 1985, Arthur Cox resigned unexpectedly after a disagreement with the club's board. The stability that had underpinned Newcastle's revival suddenly disappeared. Within a few years, familiar faces had departed. Chris Waddle moved to Tottenham Hotspur. Peter Beardsley joined Liverpool, The team that had promised so much was slowly dismantled. Supporters found themselves asking a question they had asked too many times before. What now? The answer, unfortunately, did not arrive quickly. Results became inconsistent. Managers came and went. By 1989, Newcastle United had been relegated once again. The optimism of promotion had given way to another period of uncertainty. Financial worries grew. Attendances remained impressive, but concerns spread through the city. Could a club of this size really continue to drift? By the beginning of the 1990s, Newcastle United stood at another crossroads. One path pointed towards an uncertain future, the other towards one of the greatest transformations English football has ever seen. It would begin with a familiar face, not running down the wing this time, but standing in the technical area. Keegan was coming home once again. Chapter 10: The Impossible Revival. When Keegan returned to Newcastle United in February 1992, there was no fanfare about winning trophies. There were no conversations about the Premier League. No one spoke of title races. The challenge was far simpler: save the football club. Newcastle United were still in the second division. Results had collapsed. The threat of relegation to the third division was becoming alarmingly real. For a club of Newcastle's size, it was almost unimaginable. Supporters who had lived through the triumphs of Milburn, the European nights under Joe Harvey, and the excitement of Keegan's playing days, now feared they were watching one of England's great clubs fall apart. That was the situation Keegan inherited. He had never managed a professional football club before. There was no long list of coaching achievements, no reputation as a tactical mastermind. What he did possess was belief. From his very first day, he refused to speak like a man preparing for failure. Instead, he spoke about possibilities, about ambition, about restoring pride. It was exactly what the city needed to hear. The effect was almost immediate. St. James's Park, which had so often witnessed frustration in recent years, rediscovered its voice. Crowds grew larger. Supporters who had become accustomed to disappointment dared to hope once more. On the pitch, Newcastle began to collect the points they desperately needed. Some victories were comfortable. Others required determination until the very last whistle. Each one carried enormous significance. By the end of the season, Newcastle United had escaped relegation. To outsiders, survival may have appeared an unremarkable achievement. On Tyneside, it felt like a miracle. Keegan understood something that statistics could never fully explain. Newcastle United could not simply survive. It had to dream. Throughout the summer of 1992, he reshaped the squad, not with the resources available to England's richest clubs, but with players who shared his hunger to attack, to entertain, and to play without fear. The following season became one of the finest in the club's modern history. Week after week, Newcastle climbed the table. St. James Park became a place of expectation once again. Opponents discovered that visiting Newcastle was no longer a routine fixture. It was an examination. Week after week, Newcastle passed. By the spring of 1993, promotion was within touching distance. One final push remained. On 4th May, Newcastle traveled to Grimsby Town, knowing that victory would secure their return to the top flight. The journey from Tyneside was long. For the supporters who made it, every mile felt worthwhile. They had followed their club through years of uncertainty. Now they stood on the verge of seeing Newcastle United return to where they believed it belonged. The match itself was played beneath an unbearable tension. Every misplaced pass drew anxious gasps. Every attack carried enormous significance. Then, midway through the first half, Andy Cole broke the deadlock. Relief swept through the traveling supporters. When Gavin Peacock added a second after the interval, belief finally replaced anxiety. The final whistle confirmed it. Newcastle United were promoted. Players embraced one another on the pitch. Supporters celebrated in the stands, knowing they had witnessed one of the most important days in the club's modern history. Just over a year earlier, Newcastle had been fighting to avoid relegation to the third division. Now they were champions of the first division and heading into the newly formed Premier League. 5 days later, St. James's Park became the setting for one final celebration. Leicester City were the visitors, but the afternoon belonged to Newcastle. The home side swept to a remarkable 7-1 victory. Andy Cole scored 3. David Kelly scored 3. Rob Lee added another. When the First Division trophy was finally lifted before a packed St. James's Park, it felt like the perfect ending to an extraordinary season. Promotion would have satisfied many managers. For Kevin Keegan, it was only the beginning. Most observers expected Newcastle simply to survive in the Premier League. Keegan had different ideas. He wanted his team to attack, to entertain, to play with courage, regardless of the opposition. That summer, the squad continued to evolve. Rob Lee had already become the heartbeat of midfield, while Andy Cole was developing into one of England's most feared young strikers. Peter Beardsley returned to the club he loved, bringing creativity, experience, and an almost instinctive understanding of the black and white shirt. The pieces were falling into place. No one could yet know just how special this team would become. But across Tyneside, something extraordinary was beginning to take shape. Supporters would soon give them a name: the Entertainers. Chapter 11: The Entertainers. When Newcastle United returned to the top flight in the summer of 1993, survival was supposed to be the ambition. Newly promoted clubs were expected to be cautious, organized, pragmatic. Kevin Keegan had little interest in any of those things. He believed football should be played with courage. If his team had the opportunity to attack, they attacked. If they could score another goal, they tried. It was a philosophy that thrilled supporters and terrified defenders. From the very beginning of the inaugural Premier League season, Newcastle looked different. There was an energy about them, a confidence that seemed to grow with every passing week. St. James's Park became one of the most intimidating places in English football once again, not because visiting teams expected hostility, because they expected to be overwhelmed. The football was fast, fearless, relentlessly attacking. Peter Beardsley drifted effortlessly between midfield and attack, seeing passes that others never imagined. Andy Cole emerged as one of the country's most devastating finishers, scoring with remarkable consistency. Rob Lee seemed to appear everywhere at once, arriving late into the penalty area with uncanny timing. Behind them stood players every bit as important. Barry Venison brought leadership. Steve Howe, a local lad from Wallsend, developed into one of England's most promising defenders. Pavel Cernicek became a firm favorite with supporters, his acrobatic saves often preserving Newcastle's momentum when matches threatened to slip away. The results exceeded every expectation. Newcastle did not merely survive. They finished third in the Premier League, securing qualification for the UEFA Cup. Only a year earlier, they had been playing in the second tier. Now they were back among Europe's elite. Success brought confidence. Confidence brought ambition. Keegan refused to stand still. In the summer of 1994, Newcastle broke their transfer record to sign a striker from Norwich City. Andrew Cole had already become one of the league's finest goal scorers. Now another goal scorer arrived. His name was Les Ferdinand. Powerful in the air, clinical in front of goal, unselfish in his work for the team. He seemed perfectly suited to the football Keegan wanted to play. Then came another signing that delighted supporters. David Ginola, elegant, charismatic, capable of moments that defied explanation. Watching Ginola glide past defenders often felt less like sport and more like performance. He made difficult things appear effortless. By the middle of the 1990s, Newcastle United had become essential viewing. Even neutral supporters tuned in. Nobody knew exactly what would happen when Newcastle played. Only that something probably would. Goals arrived in abundance. So did drama. There were breathtaking victories, unexpected setbacks, matches that swung wildly from one moment to the next. Keegan never asked his players to retreat into caution. If they conceded one goal, he wanted them to score two. It was football played with remarkable honesty. The 1995-96 season became the defining chapter of this remarkable team. By Christmas, Newcastle sat proudly at the top of the Premier League. As winter gave way to spring, belief spread across Tyneside. Supporters who had waited generations began to whisper a question they scarcely dared ask aloud. Could this finally be the year? Could Newcastle United become champions of England again? Every match seemed to carry greater weight than the last. The city lived from weekend to weekend. Offices, schools, pubs, homes. Every conversation eventually turned to football. The title race had become part of everyday life. Then came the pressure. Manchester United, led by Sir Alex Ferguson, began to close the gap. Every Newcastle result was examined, every mistake magnified, every point felt precious. The defining image of that season did not come from a victory. It came after a match at Ellen Road in April 1996. Newcastle had beaten Leeds United 1-0, yet Kevin Keegan looked exhausted. During a live television interview, he responded passionately to comments made by Alex Ferguson in the days before. "I would love it if we beat them." The words became one of the most famous interviews in English football. Some saw a manager cracking under pressure. Others saw a man defending his club with every ounce of emotion he possessed. Perhaps it was both. In the end, Manchester United overtook Newcastle and claimed the Premier League title. For supporters, the disappointment was profound. They had come so close, closer than anyone had imagined only a few years earlier. And yet, there was remarkably little bitterness, because Newcastle United had given the country something it had almost forgotten. A team that attacked without fear, a team that entertained before anything else, a team that made people fall in love with football. They did not lift the trophy, but they earned something different, a place in football history. Even today, decades later, people still remember them by the same name, the Entertainers. Chapter 12, Heartbreak and Heroes. The Entertainers never truly disappeared. Even after the Premier League title slipped away in 1996, the spirit of Kevin Keegan's Newcastle United remained. The football was still ambitious. The crowds were still enormous. The belief was still there. If anything, supporters became even more determined. Surely lightning couldn't strike twice. Surely a team this talented would have another chance. The summer of 1996 brought a signing that sent shockwaves through English football. Alan Shearer was coming home. Born in Newcastle and raised in nearby Gosforth, Shearer had grown up supporting the club. By then, he was already one of the finest strikers in Europe. He had won the Premier League with Blackburn Rovers. He had finished as the leading scorer at UEFA Euro 1996. Manchester United wanted him. So did clubs across Europe. Instead, he chose Newcastle United. For supporters, it felt like more than a transfer. One of their own had come home. The expectation was immense. So too was the excitement. Every goal Shearer scored seemed to strengthen the connection between player and city. He celebrated with one arm raised. The image became iconic. Children copied it in parks and playgrounds across the Northeast. Yet football has an unfortunate habit of refusing to follow the script. Just months into the new season, Kevin Keegan stunned English football by resigning as manager. His departure left supporters heartbroken. It was difficult to imagine Newcastle United without him. In only 4 years, he had rescued the club from the brink of disaster, restored it to the top flight, and turned it into genuine title challengers. He had given the city its belief back. Replacing him was never going to be easy. The task fell to Kenny Dalglish, already one of the most respected figures in British football. Dalglish inherited a team filled with talent, but burdened by expectation. The style gradually changed. The relentless attacking football that had defined Keegan's Newcastle became more measured, more cautious. Some supporters accepted the change. Others struggled to recognize the team they had fallen in love with. Even so, success remained within reach. In 1998, Newcastle United reached the FA Cup final. For thousands of supporters, Wembley once again became the destination. Families boarded coaches before dawn. Special trains carried black and white scarves towards London. Stories were shared between generations. Parents who had traveled to Wembley decades earlier now sat beside children, making the journey for the first time. The dream felt wonderfully familiar. Arsenal proved too strong. Newcastle returned home empty-handed. A year later, they were back. Another FA Cup final. Another chance. Another sea of black and white flowing through the streets of London. This time, Manchester United stood in the way. United were chasing an unprecedented treble. Newcastle fought with determination. But once again, the trophy slipped away. 2 consecutive FA Cup finals. 2 painful defeats. For many clubs, reaching Wembley twice would have been remembered as an extraordinary achievement. On Tyneside, it simply became another chapter in the long story of coming so close. By the end of the decade, another change was approaching. Kenny Dalglish departed. Ruud Gullit arrived. His appointment generated excitement, but his time at Newcastle quickly became difficult. Results were inconsistent. Relationships within the squad became strained. Perhaps most controversially, Alan Shearer was left out of the starting lineup for the Tyne-Wear derby against Sunderland. The decision stunned supporters. When Newcastle lost the match, Gullit's position became increasingly uncertain. Only a few days later, he left the club. Once again, Newcastle United found themselves searching for direction. Supporters had experienced soaring hope, followed by disappointment, followed by uncertainty. It was becoming an all too familiar cycle. Then, in the autumn of 1999, another familiar face returned to Tyneside. Not a local hero this time, but someone who understood exactly what Newcastle United could become. His name was Bobby Robson, and for many supporters, it already felt like home. Chapter 13, Sir Bobby. There are some people in football who seem destined to find their way home. Sir Bobby Robson was one of them. He had been born in County Durham. As a boy, he had stood on the terraces at St. James's Park, dreaming of the day he might somehow become part of Newcastle United. Life had taken him elsewhere. He built an extraordinary career as both player and manager. He won league titles in the Netherlands and Portugal. He lifted European trophies. He managed England to a World Cup semi-final. He coached some of the greatest players the game has ever known. Yet one job always remained unfinished. In September 1999, at the age of 66, Bobby Robson finally became manager of Newcastle United. The timing could hardly have been more difficult. The club had endured a miserable start to the Premier League season. Confidence had disappeared. Supporters feared another campaign, spent looking over their shoulders rather than up the table. Robson arrived with no grand promises. He spoke instead about hard work, about togetherness, about enjoying football again. It sounded simple. Sometimes simple is exactly what is needed. His first match could hardly have gone better. Newcastle defeated Sheffield Wednesday by a remarkable margin, and suddenly St. James's Park rediscovered something that had been missing for far too long: smiles. It was never simply about one result. It was about the feeling that someone understood the club. Robson knew what Newcastle meant to its supporters because, in many ways, he had once been one of them. Players responded to him immediately. Alan Shearer flourished under his leadership. The partnership between manager and captain was built on mutual respect rather than theatrics. Neither man needed to be the loudest voice in the room. Their standards spoke loudly enough. Around them, another exciting group of footballers began to emerge. Gary Speed brought intelligence and consistency to midfield. Kieran Dyer offered pace and energy. Norberto Solano became one of the Premier League's finest crossers of a football, combining beautifully with Shearer on countless occasions. At the heart of the defense stood Jonathan Woodgate, whose composure and reading of the game marked him out as one of England's brightest young defenders. Robson had always believed that talented players should be trusted. His Newcastle side reflected that philosophy. They attacked with purpose. They moved the ball quickly. Most importantly, they played with freedom. By the early years of the new century, Newcastle United were once again competing near the top of English football. Qualification for the UEFA Champions League returned European nights to St. James Park. The stadium seemed transformed beneath the floodlights. Long before kickoff, supporters gathered outside, scarves wrapped tightly against the cold northeast air. Inside, the anticipation was almost tangible. When the Champions League anthem echoed around the ground, it served as a reminder of how far the club had traveled. Only a decade earlier, Newcastle had been fighting to avoid relegation to the third tier. Now some of Europe's greatest clubs were arriving on Tyneside. Those nights created memories that supporters still speak about today. Victories over some of the continent's biggest names reminded everyone that St. James's Park remained one of football's great stages. The football reflected the city itself, passionate, honest, unapologetically ambitious. Of course, there were disappointments too. There always are. League titles remained just out of reach. Cup competitions ended in frustration. Alan Shearer continued to score goals with remarkable consistency, but the major trophy supporters longed for refused to arrive. Yet Bobby Robson understood something deeper. A football club cannot measure itself only by the medals in its cabinet. It is measured by the connection between the team and the people who follow it. In that respect, Newcastle United had rediscovered its identity. Supporters believed again. Children once more dreamed of wearing black and white. The city walked a little taller. Eventually, football moved on, as it always does. In 2004, Sir Bobby left Newcastle United. For many supporters, it was a painful farewell. He had not delivered the trophy everyone wanted. What he had restored was something almost as valuable: pride. Years later, whenever supporters speak about Bobby Robson, they rarely begin with league positions or statistics. Instead, they talk about the warmth in his smile, his love of football, his unmistakable affection for Newcastle United. Some managers leave behind silverware, others leave behind memories. Sir Bobby Robson left behind something even greater. He reminded an entire city why it had fallen in love with its football club in the first place. But football rarely stands still. A new era was about to begin, one filled with enormous expectations, unexpected frustrations, and eventually, the greatest goal scorer in Newcastle United's history saying goodbye. Chapter 14, Through the Wilderness. Football clubs rarely travel in straight lines. For every golden generation, there is often a period of uncertainty waiting just around the corner. When Sir Bobby Robson left Newcastle United in 2004, supporters feared they might lose more than a manager. They feared they might lose the identity he had helped restore. For a time, optimism remained. Alan Shearer was still leading the line. St. James Park was still filled week after week. European football had become familiar. From the outside, Newcastle United still looked like one of England's biggest clubs. Inside, the picture was becoming more complicated. Managers came and went. Ideas changed. Long-term planning often gave way to short-term solutions. One season offered promise. The next brought disappointment. Supporters who had lived through the excitement of Keegan and the warmth of Bobby Robson found themselves searching for that same feeling once again. Through it all, one constant remained: Alan Shearer. Year after year, he continued to score, powerful in the air, clinical with either foot, uncompromising in his determination to win. He carried the expectations of an entire city with remarkable consistency. There were memorable victories, European nights, cup runs that hinted at better days ahead. Yet the feeling persisted that Newcastle were drifting rather than building. Then, in 2006, an era quietly came to an end. Alan Shearer retired from professional football. He left as Newcastle United's record goal scorer. More than that, he left as the symbol of a generation. Supporters had watched local heroes before: Jackie Milburn, Kevin Keegan, though adopted rather than born on Tyneside. Now Shearer joined that company. His raised arm after another goal had become one of the defining images of modern Newcastle United. Replacing goals is difficult. Replacing what a player means to a city is almost impossible. As one chapter closed, another was becoming increasingly controversial. In 2007, businessman Mike Ashley completed his takeover of Newcastle United. At first, many supporters welcomed the change. Fresh investment appeared to promise a brighter future. There was hope that Newcastle might once again challenge English football's elite, those hopes faded quickly. Decisions made away from the pitch increasingly dominated conversations on it. Managers changed with unsettling regularity. Club legends departed. Supporters began to feel disconnected from the people, making decisions about the club they loved. The relationship between owners and supporters grew strained. Protest became a familiar sight outside St. James's Park. Black and white scarves were joined by banners expressing frustration rather than celebration. For many supporters, it was never simply about results. It was about feeling that the club understood the city it represented. In 2009 came another painful blow. Newcastle United were relegated from the Premier League. The disbelief was enormous. Few clubs possessed such passionate support. Few filled such a magnificent stadium every week. Yet once again, Newcastle found themselves in the second tier. If history had taught the city anything, it was not to give up. Supporters continued to pack St. James's Park. Away followings remained among the largest in the country. The shirt still mattered. The badge still mattered. The club still mattered. Under Chris Hughton, Newcastle responded in the best possible way. There were no grand speeches, no extravagant promises, only consistency, humility, hard work. The team earned promotion at the first attempt, restoring Newcastle to the Premier League and giving supporters another reason to believe. It was a reminder that success does not always arrive with the biggest personalities. Sometimes it arrives quietly. The years that followed brought moments of genuine excitement. A new generation of players emerged. European football briefly returned. There were afternoons when St. James's Park crackled with the electricity of old, but lasting momentum always seemed just out of reach. Managers changed, plans changed. The sense of uncertainty remained. As the decade drew to a close, many supporters wondered whether they would ever again experience the joy of watching Newcastle compete with England's very best. It had been so long since the city had truly dared to dream. Yet football has a remarkable habit of changing when least expected. In 2021, everything changed. Not overnight, not immediately on the pitch, but the direction of the football club had shifted. For the first time in many years, Newcastle United looked towards the future with genuine optimism. A new chapter was about to begin, one that would carry the club back into Europe, back among England's elite, and back to Wembley once more. Chapter 15, Dreaming Again. For much of the previous decade, hope had become a difficult thing to hold on to. Supporters still filled St. James's Park. They still traveled the length of the country. They still sang with the same passion. Their parents and grandparents had shone before them. But hope had become cautious. Years of false dawns had taught Newcastle supporters not to expect too much. Then, in October 2021, the football club entered a new era. A consortium led by the Public Investment Fund of Saudi Arabia completed its takeover of Newcastle United, ending Mike Ashley's 14-year ownership. Around St. James's Park, thousands gathered to witness the moment. Some celebrated, some remained cautious. Most simply felt relieved that change had finally arrived. Yet ownership alone could not transform a football club. The team still faced a difficult reality. By the winter of that season, Newcastle found themselves near the foot of the Premier League table. Relegation was a genuine possibility. Money could not buy enough points before May. What the club needed first was leadership. That leadership arrived in November 2021. Eddie Howe, quiet, thoughtful, meticulous. He was not the glamorous appointment some had expected. There were no extravagant promises. Instead, Howe spoke about standards, hard work, improvement, one training session at a time. It sounded familiar. The greatest Newcastle managers had often begun in exactly the same way. Slowly, the team changed. Players who had looked short of confidence suddenly looked transformed. Fitness improved. Belief returned. Victories followed. By the end of the season, Newcastle had climbed clear of danger. Survival alone would have been considered success. Instead, it felt like the beginning of something much bigger. The following season exceeded almost everyone's expectations. Newcastle defended with discipline, attacked with purpose, worked harder than nearly every opponent they faced. There were no passengers. Every player understood their role. Every tackle was celebrated. Every goal felt earned. St. James's Park became one of the loudest stadiums in the country once again. Under the floodlights, the old ground seemed to shake. Opposing teams spoke openly about the atmosphere. Supporters sensed that something they had not experienced for many years was returning. Connection, manager, players, supporters, all pulling in the same direction. In February 2023, Newcastle reached their first major domestic cup final for almost a quarter of a century. Once again, Wembley called. Once again, black and white scarves filled trains, coaches and motorways heading south. Some supporters had waited their entire lives for this journey. Others remembered traveling with parents or grandparents decades before. The result did not bring the ending they had hoped for. Manchester United lifted the trophy. For Newcastle supporters, it was another painful walk away from Wembley, another final, another near miss. Yet this time, the disappointment felt different. The club was no longer looking back at what it had lost. It was looking forward to what it might become. Only a few months later came another milestone. Newcastle United qualified for the UEFA Champions League for the first time in 2 decades. European football returned to St. James's Park, and with it came nights that reminded supporters why their stadium had always been regarded as one of football's great stages. When the Champions League anthem echoed around the ground once more, many simply stood in silence. Some smiled. Others thought of parents and grandparents who had introduced them to Newcastle United, but were no longer there to witness the club's return. It was a reminder that football has always been about more than 90 minutes. It connects generations. The following seasons brought new challenges, but also growing belief. Eddie Howe continued to shape a side built not only on talent, but on discipline, unity, and relentless effort. The supporters recognized those qualities. The connection between the team and the city grew stronger with every passing month. Then, in March 2025, Newcastle United returned to Wembley. Once again, black and white scarves filled trains and motorways heading south. Once again, generations of families made the journey together. Many had been here before, too many times. They remembered the disappointments. They remembered the long journeys home. This time, they dared to believe that history might finally change. When the final whistle sounded, it had. Newcastle United had won the League Cup for the first time since lifting the FA Cup in 1955. The club had claimed a major domestic trophy. 70 years of waiting were over. Across Tyneside, celebrations stretched long into the night. Strangers embraced in the streets. Car horns echoed across the city. Black and white flags appeared from windows and balconies. For older supporters, it was something they had waited a lifetime to see. For younger ones, it was the first great triumph they could truly call their own. It was more than a cup final. It was the reward for generations of unwavering faith. Tonight, St. James's Park still stands high above the city. On match days, the same streets fill with black and white scarves. Children still walk beside parents and grandparents, just as they have for generations. Some remember Jackie Milburn, others remember Keegan. Some grew up watching Shearer. Today's children will have heroes of their own. The names change, the shirts change, managers come and go, owners come and go, but the heartbeat of Newcastle United remains remarkably familiar. It belongs to the people who have carried the club through triumph and disappointment for well over a century. Perhaps that is why Newcastle United has endured, not because every season ended in glory, but because every generation believed the next one might. And as the floodlights shine over St. James Park, and another Saturday becomes another memory, the story waits patiently for its next chapter. Because the history of Newcastle United is not really a story with an ending. It is simply a story that is still being written. Manchester United lifted the trophy. For Newcastle supporters, it was another painful walk away from Wembley, another final, another near miss. Yet this time, the disappointment felt different. The club was no longer looking back at what it had lost. It was looking forward to what it might become. Only a few months later came another milestone. Newcastle United qualified for the UEFA Champions League for the first time in 2 decades. European football returned to St. James's Park, and with it came nights that reminded supporters why their stadium had always been regarded as one of football's great stages. When the Champions League anthem echoed around the ground once more, many simply stood in silence. Some smiled. Others thought of parents and grandparents who had introduced them to Newcastle United, but were no longer there to witness the club's return. It was a reminder that football has always been about more than 90 minutes. It connects generations. The following seasons brought new challenges, but also growing belief. Eddie Howe continued to shape a side built not only on talent, but on discipline, unity, and relentless effort. The supporters recognized those qualities. The connection between the team and the city grew stronger with every passing month. Then, in March 2025, Newcastle United returned to Wembley. Once again, black and white scarves filled trains and motorways heading south. Once again, generations of families made the journey together. Many had been here before, too many times. They remembered the disappointments. They remembered the long journeys home. This time, they dared to believe that history might finally change. When the final whistle sounded, it had. Newcastle United had won the League Cup for the first time since lifting the FA Cup in 1955. The club had claimed a major domestic trophy. 70 years of waiting were over. Across Tyneside, celebrations stretched long into the night. Strangers embraced in the streets. Car horns echoed across the city. Black and white flags appeared from windows and balconies. For older supporters, it was something they had waited a lifetime to see. For younger ones, it was the first great triumph they could truly call their own. It was more than a cup final. It was the reward for generations of unwavering faith. Tonight, St. James's Park still stands high above the city. On match days, the same streets fill with black and white scarves. Children still walk beside parents and grandparents, just as they have for generations. Some remember Jackie Milburn, others remember Keegan. Some grew up watching Alan Shearer. Today's children will have heroes of their own. The names change, the shirts change, managers come and go, owners come and go, but the heartbeat of Newcastle United remains remarkably familiar. It belongs to the people who have carried the club through triumph and disappointment for well over a century. Perhaps that is why Newcastle United has endured, not because every season ended in glory, but because every generation believed the next one might. And as the floodlights shine over St. James Park, and another Saturday becomes another memory, the story waits patiently for its next chapter. Because the history of Newcastle United is not really a story with an ending. It is simply a story that is still being written.